Welcome to Catholic Courses. I'm your professor, Dr. Brad Birzer, and we're going to be studying Catholics in American history, both the Catholic influence on the formation of the United States and the conflicts fought or endured during our 200 years of history here as a nation. We have to ask why. What's the reason for us looking at this kind of history? What we find, of course, is that from the very beginning, from all the way back to colonial settlement of the Americas, there was a race to control the continent of North America. And as every school child knows, 1492 is one of the most singularly important dates in world history. Not only did the Spanish drive finally the Muslims out of Spain after 8 centuries of warfare, but a group of Mediterranean men discovered what would become a new world. Now, when we think of this, we have to put this into perspective. It would be impossible for us to really understand in our current day what it means to discover a new world. There had been dreams of what a new world might look like for years, going all the way back to Plato, if not before. A desire to find Atlantis, or the Blessed Isles, or the realm of the gods, always presented in the West. In fact, the very first term use of this was Europa. Europa was the Greek for place of freedom. It was barbaric freedom, but it was freedom nonetheless. And so as they dreamt about what might be West, the ideas that came to those who discovered America in 1492, of course not recognizing that for almost another decade, but when they realized what they had done, they understood that perhaps there was a connection to the ancient world. They wondered if Christianity was now to be providentially driven into an entirely new continent, to an entirely new people. But again, they're not alone. We now have evidence, some of our best evidence coming from recent satellite technology, to recognize that the Japanese had been here, maybe thousands of years ago. We know that Irish monks under St. Brendan had explored the North American coast sometime around 550 AD. Of course, the Vikings had settled parts of Canada. And we know that even Bristol fishermen had sailed off the coast of North America, giving their own understanding of this to Christopher Columbus. Columbus then was inspired, and ultimately he was able to raise the money, able to raise the capital, and he then, of course, discovered America, though he did not know it, in 1492. Once this had happened, once there was a desire to find and to explore this new world, at this moment, the question became, what would be the motivation? Quite often, our textbooks will explain that the Spanish came really for God and for gold. But quite often, they focus on the gold and then smirk at the idea of God. Whereas, in fact, the Spanish were quite concerned with extending God's realm, proselytizing, evangelizing the natives in North America just as much as they were in finding the gold. In fact, for us to separate God and gold now is a modern convention. For them, gold was a gift of God. Gold was meant as a plastic. It was material. It was meant to be used to extend the realm of God's influence into the New World. And so we can be cynical about this, and there's no doubt that as the Europeans began to compete after the Reformation for all of this great land and trying to discover who would gain hold of it first, they were very willing to make all kinds of rumors, stories, myths, legends, the most famous being the dark legend of the Spanish. And out of this, we can never separate it from the Reformation. Out of this came the legend which was known as the Black Legend. The idea that Catholicism was something that was regressive, that Catholicism was oppressive, it was dark, it was superstitious. And so when the English spoke of their myth, they talked about themselves as a new chosen people. This is when the whole story of Joseph of Arimathea taking the cup of the Last Supper, this is why he brought it to England, why he brought it to Britain. It was a symbol that the English would be the new chosen people as opposed to the Spanish, who were in fact the repressors of the world because they were papists. So from the very beginning of American settlement, we must realize that there was always this competition, and that competition lingers, if only in vague memory, to this day. One of the historians that I admire most, someone who clearly was not Catholic, though he had a deep, maybe begrudging respect for the Jesuits, was a man by the name of Francis Parkman, a Boston Brahmin. And he wrote an entire series of books, possibly the greatest histories written in the 19th century, because these were literary histories. These were kind of the histories that an academic might sit down in his office and focus and narrow on one thing. What Parkman did is he traveled everywhere that he spoke of, everywhere that he wrote of. And he interviewed people, he tried to find the customs of the time, but his view that he presents in the middle of the 19th century becomes really the standard view of how Americans would see their own settlement of North America. This will be revealed later in the acts of Buffalo Bill and his Wild West show. It will be revealed later in Hollywood movies all the way through the 20th century. This became the model. This is what Parkman writes in his own description, and he's a beautiful writer in every way. So whether we agree with his own ideas or not, we have to recognize there's an artistry in this. But we also have to recognize that no matter how false he is in his belief, he did believe this, and so did most Americans of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. The springs of American civilization, unlike those of the elder world, lie revealed in the clear light of history. In appearance, they are feeble. Acting at the sources of life, instruments otherwise weak become mighty for good and evil, and men, lost elsewhere in the crowd, stand forth as agents of destiny. Now, if we just pause there for a moment, and we think about the impact and the import of what Parkman is saying, we see two things immediately. Number one, there is this Manichaean struggle here on the North American continent, a struggle between good and evil. And of course, this means really, from his perspective, a struggle between Protestantism and Catholicism. So Parkman is concerned with this issue. But at the same time, we can already start hearing that very, very touchy, and in fact, we might even say dreadful, because it violates so many Catholic social principles, the idea of manifest destiny. The idea that somehow God, and this dates back to the idea of the English being the chosen people because of Joseph of Arimathea, the idea that somehow God has granted Protestants North America so that the agents of destiny would promote light and goodness and the Bible and all things that Protestants considered to be their own, as opposed to what the Catholics had. In their toils, Parkman continues, in their sufferings, their conflicts, momentous questions were at stake and issues vital to the future of the world. The prevalence of races, the triumph of principles, health or disease, a blessing or a curse. On the obscure strife where men died by tens or by scores hung questions of as deep import for posterity as on mighty contests of national adolescence where carnage is reckoned by the thousands. Now, clearly these words were written a generation before the Civil War, where we might see a battlefield after a day with 25,000 bodies strewn across a few acres. This was not atypical in the Civil War. But certainly at the time that Parkman is writing in the 1840s and in the 1850s, before the American Civil War, war was still a gentleman's sport in almost every way. And there were very civilized ways in which men fought.